So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So for everybody, my name is Frazier, and I am the founder and CEO of Curated by Kai, where we create inclusive VR classrooms for students globally. I list my credentials up here because I want you just to know how out of place I am right now in San Francisco. So I have my degree in history and education, and I just moved across the country from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. And this is Tech Inclusion 2018, and my directions were to go deep. So in order to talk about my work in VR and how it's empowering students to dream big, I have to first tell you how I got here. So if I'm being fully transparent, my journey started when I was in high school. I would actually suddenly find myself homeless, and I couch surfed a lot of nights, and I actually slept in my car, my 1985 Toyota Corolla. But my life changed in high school when I had a couple in the middle that took a chance on me, and they invited me into their home so I could finish high school. And when you're focused on survival, that means your grades aren't very good. So my grades were terrible in high school. My motto was actually C's get degrees. And math was my worst subject. When I would see numbers, I would break down and just start crying. And it was my high school math teacher that told me the reason why I wasn't good at math was because I was defeated before I even started. And that whole outlook changed my entire life. So how did I get into history? My history teacher also knew I was homeless, and he gave me books to keep me busy. One of those was Congressman John Lewis, his memoir, Walking with the Wind. It showed me my first strong example that history could actually be a career. It also showed me a civil rights icon who didn't end up murdered and still today is getting into good trouble being a voice for the voiceless even at 75. And it showed me my first real life hack. I could actually get A's in school, specifically in history, if I could just listen to stories and repeat them back. Nothing had to balance, it didn't have to make sense. It was actually the opposite of math. It was, could I just listen and repeat? And that's how I ended up getting a degree in history and African American studies. I like this quote. It's from the first page of his book, and John Lewis says that he's forever indebted to the wonderful, powerful, magnificent spirit of history. He was touched by that spirit long ago, and it's followed him ever since, and he hopes and prays that his journey continues to be blessed. And I feel like that's how my history career has taken me. So when you've been shown grace like that, you have to pay it forward. So I became a history teacher for at-risk students, and the students that reminded me of myself. So my classroom consisted of my homeless students like me, my dreamers, my illiterate students, my failing students, my students in poverty, my students with incarcerated parents, my students who had no food at home, meaning that if we had a snow day over there suspended, they don't eat that day. Weekends, they don't eat. And my students who barely spoke any English. And it was my job to break down those complex lessons of history so they could apply it to their own world and better understand it. And I went on to do the same for some of the biggest museums in Washington, D.C. I have to stress again, I have no background in tech. But what I did find through all of that is that I really enjoyed storytelling. So that's where I pivoted my career. So I went on to work for museums where it was my job to educate people across the globe by telling stories of world history. So I specialize in producing and directing stories of struggle, and specifically stories of genocide and mass atrocities. So I had the pleasure of working with Holocaust survivors, Syrian survivors, ISIS survivors, Rwandan survivors that looked just like me, and more. And I got so good at it that some of my stories ended up at the Department of State and even the Congressional Foreign Affairs Committees. So I made it my job to tell histories, to connect history to the present, and how I could do that to affect change. My full circle moment was I actually got to meet John Lewis and tell his story, and the same story that inspired me to get into this field in the first place, and he actually signed my book. So that was all great, but when I went from telling these stories and I went back to my day in the life at museums, I had to realize this was still my world. After I produced my story, what wasn't happening was outreach. So that's how I got into VR, because this couldn't be our world at museums. The problem that I saw was that my students couldn't learn about the world around them because they didn't know these opportunities existed. We tend to mistake proximity with access. We think because these kids live in Washington, D.C., they know about the free museums. Well, they don't. We think that because we're in Oakland, California, the kids in Oakland know about the tech in San Francisco. Well, I've worked with lots of middle school kids who've never even been to San Francisco, and they live 15 minutes across the street in Oakland or across the bridge. So a lot of these kids are falling through the cracks. So I got into VR to try to find a way to share the powerful lessons of history with students. And I wanted them to learn from their ancestors the same way I did, so they could know, regardless of what they went through, they could overcome anything they put their minds to. And I'm a firm believer that if you're going to solve big problems, you have to take even bigger risk. So I sold my house, I sold my car, I sold just about everything I had. This is my last picture I took in DC, which was my bin of clothes, my chalkboard wall that I had, my laptop, and my Google Cardboard. And I decided I was going to move across the country from DC to the Bay Area so I could learn all I could about ed tech to make learning solutions for students so they could have resources that actually looked like them in school. And it was super scary, and I'm not going to lie, it still is super scary. I'm 6 months in right now. So my company is curated by Kai, and we create those inclusive and representative VR experiences. So I stop right here always because I don't want to assume everybody knows what VR is. So when we're talking about VR, we're talking about wearable technology that you put on, and once you're in that 3D simulated environment, the cool thing is your brain really can't figure out what's real and what's not. And that's how we're able to basically give these representative experiences to kids so they can see different stories and careers and histories and ideas. And when they see this representative content, for that second, their brain thinks they're actually in it, right? So they know that their dreams are attainable. And if you don't know how powerful representation is, then I offer you this viral photo of 2-year-old Riley gazing at the photo of Michelle Obama that went viral earlier in February when these photos were unveiled. So what we do is we film these representative art, just like the Michelle Obama portrait and the Barack Obama portrait, and we bring it back to kids. So it's been great because these are kids that this is a child in Oakland who may not ever get to DC, right? Or may not get to DC soon, and they can see the art that looks like them and have that same experience from their homes, from their classrooms. But the problem that I'm still seeing is there are not enough diverse voices in the field, which limits the content and the narratives that are making it back to these students. So from this, unless we have more people taking risk and venturing into these newer fields, we risk an entire generation that lacks these diverse voices and narratives in these new mediums like AR and VR and AI. One of the things I commonly see is that a lot of the VR experiences are in English, right? These are my students from my school in Virginia who did not speak English. All they can do is smile at me. So we went to the MLK Memorial and we filmed in English and in Spanish. I had my students actually translate this for me so these kids could have learning resources that they could actually understand right now in their classrooms so they are no longer excluded. We always think that tech is going to be the great equalizer, but what I was seeing is it was making things worse for my students faster. So I always hear VR is a big empathy machine. I saw this experience and I cried because I felt differently about fill in the blank, right? But for me, I already have large amounts of empathy, so these are not the experiences that make me excited. And I don't do a lot of VR experiences because I don't find a lot that have me in mind when they're created. But I had to eat my words this month because I had a young black guy, he invited me to do his data visualization VR. And as soon as I put the headset on, I was surrounded by math and numbers and data, and I felt my eyes watering. And then I had to realize my eyes weren't watering because I didn't understand math. They were watering because for the first time I understood math. I did not feel excluded, I felt empowered, and I had access through virtual reality. So this is another VR experience you can always check out. Is Derek Hand's I Have a Man VR experience. It takes you through a powerful civil rights narrative when MLK was assassinated. But now, in my last minute, I try to bring it back to show you that we always think we're great because we're in these tech fields, but we have to stop and realize that we have our ancestors that we owe our work to, but we never think that we are somebody else's ancestors too. So the people who are not in this room today, they can walk through the doors because we actually opened them for them. My big takeaway that I want you guys to think about is what are you personally doing right now to create pipelines for students who can't be here? In addition to my startup, I work with schools teaching the kids how to be not only consumers of VR, but how to be producers of VR. I give them their first VR headsets, show them what a 360 camera looks like, show them Unity and web VR, because they're never gonna get it if it's not people like me that are going into these schools. We can't complain about inclusion if we're not including the generation behind us, So once again, this is my closing. Diversity is your superpower to these kids. So if they see you, they know it's possible. If they don't see you, they don't know it's possible. So if you are present in these schools, their dreams are attainable. So find an accountability partner. Say, we're going to go to one school twice a year. Done. What would the workforce look like in 2 years, 5 years, right? It's not up to companies and governments to do this work. It's up to us because we're already here. So I'm going to close right there. So thank you so much, everybody. If you want to contact me, this is all my information.
Dope, dope.